Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. I'm here with Philip. Philip, would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yes, sure. My name is Philipp Röttgers, which, as you can all hear, is a German name. Uh, you can tell it from the umlaut, the Ö, so it's Röttgers, but I've heard people calling me Röttgers or Rogers or whichever way you prefer to pronounce it. But you can just call me Phil or Philip. So hi, I'm Phil.
How'd you get interested in the Jack the Ripper case?
Um, it must have been a couple of years ago. I must have been like I think 16 or 17. Well, first of all, I've always been fascinated by London history. British. So I'm from Germany, as I mentioned, just as a background. Um, I'm from Germany, but I've always been interested in British history, especially in London history, culture, music, all that stuff. I've always been very, Anglophile, as they say. Um, and so one day, in the I think I was, as I said, 16 or 17. Of a sudden, I typed Jack the Ripper into Google. I don't know why this came to me. Just click. And I said Jack the Ripper. Typed it in. Ended up on a German website about the Ripper murders. A very good one. Jack the Ripper.de, the German website, and I was fascinated. I read, I began reading, and I was like, wow, this is so very fascinating. I've always been interested, as I said, in British history, but also in a bit of mysterious stuff, true crime stuff, bit of dark history, as you like. And I just thought this is so interesting because it's kind of a glimpse into a bygone era, because it opens a window to this very actually short period of time, just a couple of weeks in the autumn of 1888. But it's so detailed, and you get to learn so much about the living conditions, the social conditions, the history, the Victorian history of that time. So that was what really drew me into it. I mean, also because the rapist or the murderer has never been caught, so that was fascinating too for me. But it's not especially about the murderer or the crimes themselves. It's more about the bigger picture, if you like, that really fascinated me. And that's how I started. And since then I became a ripperologist, if you like. Got more into the case, started researching myself. Yeah, and here I am today in your podcast.
From a research perspective, I'm hoping maybe you can illuminate some doors or open up some doors for me here, which is where did you go for research? Because now that I'm new to it, I type it in. There's a whole list of things that you can go into, but did you find any difference between the Jack the Ripper murders, typing that in, compared to typing in the Whitechapel murders? Because I got some different results when I typed in the Whitechapel murders, and then they got a list of things, and actually newspaper like police sketch stuff that were dealing with people that were suspects or something that was named in the Jack the Ripper case that happened to do with that. But then if you type in Jack the Ripper, you get more Hollywood IMDb pages and movies and films and things that came out that made a more studioized version of the actual case. So I'm curious where you started with your research.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So there is a difference. You have to distinguish between the Whitechapel murderer and Jack the Ripper, if you like, because the Whitechapel murderer, well, first of all, he existed. We don't know who he was, who it was, but this person existed and murdered, uh, women. We don't really know how many, because no one really knows. There's the canonical five, but how many more did he kill? And there's this figure, this character, if you like, Jack the Ripper. As you say, you end up on a lot of films and all those novels dealing with Jack the Ripper. That's more about this legend, that appeared, and because of the name also Jack the Ripper, it kind of created a phantom. Um, so of course there is a difference. We have to distinguish between these two. Um, so when it comes to research, I mean, there's a if you want to look at particular aspects of the case, first of all, get an overview of the case of the Whitechapel murders, and then dig into the case. If you go to the internet, on the internet, for example, there's a very good website called casebook.org. This is very good. You have to be careful to not, you can really lose yourself in the details there, because they're very dedicated people on the forums, some of which I know, some of which I don't know, some of which I wish I knew, maybe one day. But so there's a lot of, just on the website itself, there's a lot of stuff dealing with the case, and it's a very good starting point, if you like, to start researching the case, because they've even got the newspapers listed, and you can click on them and then read the actual newspaper reports from the Autumn of Terror, from the different newspapers, from the different dates. So that's kind of interesting. Whereas, as you say, Jack the Ripper, that's a entirely different figure, as you like. And that's, if I may say that, I hope that's fine. Last year, I published a book together with my mother, actually, who's also a ripperologist, here in Germany, which deals with basically for the German market, for the German audience, which deals with just the facts about the case, because this is what happens, with the difference between the Whitechapel murders and Jack the Ripper. There's so much, so much stuff is has been put upon the actual story, that so many people just don't know what happened really, what is fact, what is fiction. And it's always good to try to to present something that says, these are just the facts, and from there you can start your journey.
Maybe you can give me a couple examples of some facts or maybe some controversial areas, something that a new person that might not know a whole lot about the case would actually probably run into and realize later down the line that it would be a falsehood. Obviously, if you speak with an author, they're going to have their suspect and they're going to think their suspect is the Ripper. So you kind of have to take it like, okay, this person believes because he's only looked at, and some of them are convincing arguments, obviously. But if you're new and you're trying to come at it with an unbiased viewpoint and accept everybody's theory, whether the person is missing an arm or whether there's a doctor that killed more people in the United States later, it makes it very complicated. So I'm hoping you could just maybe give me some examples of facts, what we know compared to things that later would get drawn on to be speculative.
Mm. So, well, for example, there's this.
Did he wear a top hat? That's the real question.
Right. I was just gonna more or less come to that. For example, there's this famous image that you mentioned, with a top hat, the long coat or whatever, and the black leather bag with the knives. And for example, this thing with the black leather bag, it's you can tell where this came from, because after the third murder, the murder of Elizabeth Stride in Dudfields Yard, um, a man was seen going down, going down quickly one of the adjacent streets by a woman who lived in this street, and she saw a man passing by, and he had this black leather bag, and she thought, oh no, this is suspicious. I'm going to report him to the police. Um, Turned out to be, it was, then it was in the papers, because everything ended up in the papers, because they kept reporting about everything, and the guy himself, he went to the police the next day after reading about himself in the papers. He said, no, I was just on my way home. I'm selling, I think it was cigarette boxes, where they put in the cigarettes. The whole bag was just full of cigarette boxes. They looked into his alibi; it was perfectly fine. But that's, for example, where this image came from, because they kept reporting about it, that the Ripper or the murderer had this black leather bag, which is it with his instruments and with his knives. So that's a funny little story, if you like. But that's just one part of this jigsaw, where you can say this is fact, and it became fiction in a way. And also there's, if you like, this big story about the Queen Victoria, or Queen Victoria's grandson, sorry, being part of the Ripper murders, either being the murderer himself, or it was Sir William Gull, the Queen's surgeon. He was the one who killed these women, because there was a huge conspiracy theory. And this is a great, this is something that many people, it's an entrance for many people to come into the story, because, for example, it's in the movie From Hell with Johnny Depp. It's in the graphic novel From Hell, and it's a great story. But that's just all there is. It's just a great story. It's got very little to do with the facts or with the details, if you look at it. Because, for example, Prince Eddie Edward Albert Edward, sorry. Um, you can tell that where he was during that time, and he wasn't, for example, in Whitechapel during the dates of the murders, and you can quite easily tell that this is just fiction. But it's a great story, and for many people, including myself, they watch these films, they think, oh, this is fascinating, and then you look into it and realize, okay, maybe it's just it's not real, but you start digging into it.
Did you ever hear about the suspicion of Sir Albert Victor?
You mean the prince?
Yeah, apparently he was going through, I guess, syphilis or something he must have contracted, and then they believe that the royal family was hiding the murders or killings and just kept it secret. That one seemed the most off to me, just because obviously everyone wants to think that there's something going on with the royal family at some point. Um, but it just didn't connect. But I noticed when I made a clip for him compared to if I made a clip to one that would say have more of a fact basis only on the thing of DNA evidence, which would be Aaron Kosminski. The royal family one trended very high up, and I think that's common with things that people just want to know there's a secret hidden behind a family in power and something of that sort. But the DNA evidence one was more something if you just typed it into Google, that would be like a top article, which I don't even, I mean, we can get to the later question of if you would verify that that would be reasonable to assume that it was Aaron Kosminski on DNA evidence. But with the random theories, I mean, do you see more getting pushed forward by authors, or do you see more? Because I know at the time media was reporting a whole storm of things. So I'm just curious what was the biggest distractor for you in the case when it came to misinformation? Was it authors or was it media from the time?
Uh, that's a good question because quite early on, because as you say, the press they kept writing about the case during the Autumn of Terror, and they kept adding stories of false theories, false evidence, just to sell their papers. And so many, especially in those early days, many authors who began writing about the crimes, they picked up these stories, took them for real, and then they ended up in their books. And later they when other researchers, later researchers, found out, this is wrong, this is wrong, this didn't happen that way. So that can be quite distracting, absolutely. um, when you well, and it's a thin line, because if you look at media, or I think one of the very first books about stories about the Ripper, was a fictional story, and it it started as a fictional story because someone just told it's called The Lodger, and it's a story about uh, um, a woman in London, or a couple in London, and they have a lodger in the house, and he behaves very oddly, and they find out later in this fictional story that he was Jack the Ripper after he's gone. I'm not quite sure about the. I don't remember. I think I read the story once, but it's been a long time. Anyway, so but this story came up because someone just told this story, and then it turned into fiction. So this is a very, very thin line. It probably never happened, but you don't really know. One example for where fact becomes fiction, or vice versa. So it's very difficult to look into it. Even today, we don't really know. It's really hard to tell what is fact and what is fiction, um, because many of the official police documents, many of them were destroyed in the Second World War. uh, Quite often you have just the police, the newspaper reports, and you read one newspaper report about a certain incident, and you read another newspaper report about the same incident, and there's some differences in there, and you just which one is right. We don't know. You can just go, all right, the majority writes this, the minority writes this. It may have been this way, but we just don't know. So it's very difficult to distinguish, or to just pick out what do we really know is a fact.
Was there enough facts when it came to the victims, their murders, obviously with mutilation and certain things that would kind of set you in a niche category for a killer?
So, sorry, that last part again. Sorry.
Like a niche category for a killer, because obviously everyone assumes, you look at the evidence at the crime scenes of any of the canonical five murders, and even if you want to look, maybe I've heard people mention things a little bit before the canonical five, and then I've heard things after. But if we just focus on the canonical five, everyone always says this person must have had surgical or some type of medical expertise or something like that. And I'm like, it's very weird. I understand with the organs taking out and that type of knowledge, of course, but also butchers, they don't need to have medical knowledge, but they know how to work around a pig, or they know how to work around certain organs and things like that. You end up limiting your viewpoint. So I'm curious if you can examine the evidence at the crime scenes and with maybe some kind of existing or similar details about the murders that could base a fact. Have you came across anything like that that would give you a fact?
Um, yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, exactly just what you said with the. So it's did the killer have anatomical knowledge? Did he have surgical knowledge? Did he have any knowledge at all, or did he just, was he just in the dark doing something, with his knife, not knowing what he did, and this is what happened? Um, So this, for example, was because after the second murder, after the murder of Annie Chapman, Dr. George Baxter Phillips, police surgeon of the H Division, who were responsible for the crimes in Spitalfields, um, he was at the inquest. Sorry, he suggested, I think he suggested, that the killer took out the womb. It only took a couple of minutes. He may have anatomical skills. And then the coroner, Winnie Baxter, he, kind of jumped on that train, and he said, "Yeah, I started, thinking about this myself, and I did some research, and this is where this kind of theory came from, that he might have been a doctor, or he might have had some anatomical knowledge." But I think, if I remember correctly, I'm not quite sure about this. I can look this up in a minute. There was Dr. Thomas Bond, for example, who was he did was the first profiler, if you like, because he did a profile of the killer after the canonical five, after the five murders. He actually did it. He began doing it after the first four, and when he was about to hand in his report, Mary Kelly that was murdered, the last victim. So he was called to the crime scene. He could examine the crime scene. He could examine the corpse. He was part of the um, of looking into all the details, looking at the body. And I think he said the killer might not have. So he ended it in his report a couple of days later. And I think he said the killer probably didn't have anatomical knowledge, but I'm not quite sure about it. I can look it up in a minute. But still, so it's very. It's another thing, as you say. A butcher probably may have had the same, or the necessary skills to do what the murderer did. So it's not really. It's something else that we just don't know. That's this. It's the thing with the Jack the Ripper case. A friend of mine, Richard Jones, he's also a ripperologist, great author, great ripperologist, wrote several books. He's a London tour guide also, one of the big ones. And he always says, the only thing that's certain about Jack the Ripper is that nothing is certain. And that kind of, sums it up, because we just don't know. For example, did he have anatomical knowledge or not? So it's just so difficult to really pick out, the facts. It really is difficult.
Is there anything that would dismiss the Satanistic theories? Because obviously, I'm starting to come across those, and I think my Tro has explained a little bit about the coins falling around somebody. It was just an accidental thing; they weren't neatly placed or anything like that. And obviously, you hear stuff, and you can want to make it more fantasy than it might be. And again, I'd have to speak to someone who studies the Satanistic angle on that. But I kind of start getting notes of a little bit of like when the message was erased about the Jewish people being involved. It's like maybe they're trying to stop this wild speculation about it being satanic involvement, or it could have evidence. I don't know, but there's trying to sort the fact into that, because when you start adding details for a book in a crime scene that necessarily might not be true, you start that becomes part of the historical record, especially on something that really doesn't have a good, thorough record.
Mhm. Um, what about the satanistic stuff? I think I'm not really sure if someone really believed, in that the perpetrator was someone who participated in Satanism or black magic, as it probably was called back then. I don't really think that was a motive. And as you say, the thing about the coins, I think that the coins were laid out at the feet of Annie Chapman, the second victim. And I think there was this story that with Mary Ann Nichols, the first victim, there were also coins laid out at her feet. But I think that's, that was, for example, that's something that I don't think that is right. You can read it in some stories, in some papers, but if you look at the majority of reports, you don't really find that. So I think that was something that was added later, maybe to, as you say, to add a certain dimension, or maybe this certain meaning to the story, although there is nothing in there. And with the message, the message, the Jews are the man who will not be blamed for nothing. If that was the message, we don't really know that, or also don't really know that, because several policemen told different versions of the story. We don't even really know if the message was from the killer, or if he just dropped Catherine Eddowes' apron with the blood in this doorway, this dark doorway. If he just happened to stop there, wiped his knife, dropped the apron. Maybe he even saw the message because there was some graffiti in the area. Maybe he just saw it and thought, oh, ha, ha, ha. What a coincidence. I'll just leave the apron here. Maybe he didn't even notice it, just dropped it here. Or maybe he wrote it. We don't know. But it's something else that, if you think, it must have been from the killer. I read one book where the author, he kind of tried to find out what the message really was about. And he created, I forgot how many, hundreds of, anagrams where he changed the letters and tried to find out the real meaning. And then he really was so focused on what he wanted to interpret into this message. It's an interesting approach, but you see, you're moving further away from reality without noticing it. If it has to mean something like whatever he tried to interpret into it. So yeah, I think it's so difficult to tell. I'm sorry, Rob. I'm just coming back to the same summary every time. We don't know. We can't really say anything for certain, unfortunately. But that's the fun, isn't it?
When it comes to your research into ripperology, what is one thing for you that is 100% clear in your mind? I don't have to ask about a suspect, but I mean, was it examining kind of the overall police stuff? I mean, what was one thing that you came across in the case where there is no doubt in your mind this is 100% exactly what it is and there's nothing else?
Um, so
It's a tough question because I'm finding it hard to do myself, and I'm just new to it.
um, so it is a tough one. Well, I do believe there are many witnesses who claim to have seen the murdered women, shortly before they were murdered with a man. So we do have some descriptions actually of the murderer, if these sightings are, if they really happened that way. But I do believe in that some of them are genuine, because the people tried, or most people, I think, they tried to help. They tried to stop this killing spree. Some of them probably, they just went to maybe they hope for some, getting some money for information, or for whatever reason, to end up in the newspaper and have their 5 minutes of fame. But I think most people, or most of these witness statements, especially with the canonical five, well, not most, but yeah, maybe most of them, I think they are genuine. So, for example, when Catherine Eddowes was seen on the entrance to Mitre Square by three men, and one of them Joseph Lavende, so she was seen standing there with another man. Three Jewish men passed by. One of them, Joseph Lavende, he notices the couple, and he later, the police find these men, they question them, and he gives a very good, or kind of a good, description of the men he saw with Catherine Eddowes, and that was 5 or 10 minutes, 50 minutes before she was murdered. So I think this was probably this happened, and he didn't, invent this story. And there are more stories, stories the wrong word, more statements like that, where I think witness statements, most of them are genuine. Of course, there are some, like for example, the George Hutchinson one. He saw Mary Kelly on the night of her murder. He claimed to see Mary Kelly, have seen Mary Kelly. We don't really know if this is. Of course, we don't know, but it's a story that it's too good to be true, and maybe he just did it to have an alibi for himself because he knew he was seen by another witness, by Sarah Lewis, because she said, I saw a man at the entrance to Miller's Court, standing there in the rain. She described the man, and this was George Hutchinson, and he probably knew that he was seen. So maybe he kind of invented a story, went to the police and, told the story about seeing Mary Kelly on the street with another man to maybe, not becoming suspicious himself. But maybe he did see her with another man. It's another thing.
What makes his account what makes his account so conflicting? I've noticed that some people say there was no witnesses, and then some people say that there was this witness. So is it because he stepped forward the next day, or he stepped forward later, or did he have some type of misremembrance or changing statements that would cause people to have speculation on whether he actually saw what he saw?
Well, he only went to the police on the day of the inquest, which is a bit, suspicious. He could have gone there earlier. And he gave a very detailed description. So he said he was standing on Commercial Street at 2 a.m. in the morning. He was out of money, and so he didn't have a bed for the night. He was staying at Victoria. I think it was Victoria Men's Club, something like that. So it was another lodging house just for men, but he didn't have money for a bed. So he was standing on Commercial Street, and he said he saw Mary Kelly, whom he knew. She approached him. She said, "Hutchinson, do you have any money?" He said, "No, sorry." And on she went. And he said he saw a man coming from the other direction, from Aldgate. And Mary Kelly spoke to him, and they both laughed. And she led the man to Miller's Court, and they passed Hutchinson under this lamppost in front of the Queen's Head pub. He tried to look the man into the eye, and the man, he looked a bit suspicious back to Hutchinson, tried to cover his face with his hat. And they went into Miller's Court. Hutchinson followed them. He heard them speak. He heard them talk. And then he waited in front of Miller's Court for 45 minutes, and they didn't come out, and then he went. So, and the description he gave of the man is so detailed. He even described his tie and his buttons, from his shirt, and every tiny detail of this man. And you think, it's in the middle of the night. The light is not very good. How can you, remember and see this man so good and give such a description? This is a bit odd. And why do you stand in front of Miller's Court for 45 minutes? Why do you wait for him to come out? In the end, maybe he was waiting because he didn't have a bed for that night. Maybe he was hoping this client would leave and Mary Kelly would say, "You know what, Hutchinson, come in, you can sleep here." Maybe that was the reason, but it's a bit suspicious because, as I said, he also only went to the police on the day of the inquest and not before. But apparently the police took him seriously. So Inspector Aberline, he took down his statement, and he seemed to believe in Hutchinson. And also he sent out 2 policemen with Hutchinson the next day or the next couple of days, because just in case Hutchinson saw this man again, he could point him out and said, "This is the man that I saw that night," which never happened. But it's many ripperologists and researchers, they are like, did this really happen, or did he just invent this story because it's too good? The witness description is too good to be, as you can't have seen him that clearly.
Yeah. Was there any suspects in the Ripper case that you've come across that have been criticized pretty heavily by ripperologists? I'm curious about the name Charles Lechmere, I think his name is. I've seen a channel talk about him, and I've seen a lot of people tend to believe that he might have been the Ripper. I don't know too much about him. I've noticed the name comes up a little bit more, much like Aaron Kosminski. I think there's probably like a top 3 I've come across where there's people that get mentioned.
Yeah, I think Lechmere is a bit of a if you mention the name, it can be a bit of a joke in the ripperologist community, because some people very much believe, that he was the Ripper, and many people say, no, I don't think that he was. So he was a witness, actually, Charles Cross. He was the first one to find Polly Nichols, first canonical victim, in Bucks Row at 3:40 in the morning on the 31st of August, 1888. And so the story is, or the ones who say that Charles Lechmere, aka Charles Cross, was the Ripper, they say that he murdered Polly Nichols and that he was interrupted by Robert Paul coming along Bucks Row. And in his the witness statement is, Charles Cross says, I was on my way to work. I went along Bucks Row. I saw this thing lying on the side of the road. I thought it was a tarpaulin, so I went there. I noticed it was a woman. And then I had footsteps behind me and turned around. Then Robert Paul came, and that's the official version. This is how it's been, it's been a known fact for years. Well, many people believed it to have been a fact for years. And someday, I don't know when and why, someone came up and said, maybe he was the killer. Maybe he had just murdered her and was interrupted. And also because of this name thing. So his real name was Charles Lechmere. And he gave the name of Charles Cross at the inquest and to the police. But I think that was because, so I'm not too much into him as a suspect. So don't know the story 100%. I think it must have been, I think Cross was like his mother's maiden name. And I think Lechmere was, oh no, sorry. I think Lechmere was his name, but Cross was the name of another family member who was with the police. So there was some I don't really remember the details, but there was some good reason why he chose the name Cross and not Lechmere. At least for him, there must have been some reason. But yeah, then someone said, if he killed Polly Nichols, maybe he killed the other one. Let's have a look at the other ones. And I think his way to work kind of, past some of the murder sites. And, he lived in the area, so he knew the area quite well. He kind of fits, because of that and because for some other reasons, he kind of fits the kind of profile, if you like, of who the killer might have been. But then again, I think he lived up until 1920s, 30s. He became an old man. There's even a photograph of him as an old man. So all of a sudden he must have stopped and then, just continued to live there, live his life and, die at an old age. I'm not really convinced, but I read something about him. I watched some documentaries about him. But I just told you I'm not too much into him as a suspect, so I forgot all the details
that's
about
fine.
why he became a suspect. Because I don't really, it doesn't really work for me. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't him. Kosminski, on the other hand, that's something really interesting because everything's again, who was Kosminski? Is he the Kosminski we think he was? And then there's the DNA evidence.
Is that who you think is the suspect in your mind? Is the best suspect is Kosminski? The DNA stuff really does kind of solidify it for me, but I've seen some critiques of like the blood. You can't really use that or something like that. So I mean, I understand that maybe that technology is a little bit over my pay grade there, but I think it is pretty convincing just because it's we do have modern technology to be able to examine things, and some people, I guess, speculate that the shawl wasn't there or whatever. I'm just curious, who's the suspect for you that you feel like is the most appealing in an aspect of being related to the Jack the Ripper case?
So it's difficult for me because I don't really have one suspect where I would say it was him. Kosminski, for example, he kind of fits a certain type of character, if you like, that I think may have been the Ripper, or was very close to who the Ripper was. So I think it was someone from the area, because he knew the area, he knew all the alleyways, nooks and crannies. He knew the police beats. He could move there without being seen. He could probably talk to the women because they trusted him. They went with him to these dark places. They took him there. So it must have been someone from that community, from that area. I and it must have been someone who, you wouldn't really have, you know, he didn't really stick out. No one would have said, "Oh, he must have, he must be very weird. He's very weird. He must be the Ripper." He must have appeared very normal, I think, and as I said, probably even quite charming to the women because they followed him, which is something that doesn't really work with Kosminski. Not, if we leave out the DNA stuff, which I'm not convinced about either. I think it's I'm not a fan of this DNA theory, but apart from that, the Kosminski that we know about, Aaron Kosminski, he must have been really insane because he ended up in the asylum, and that wouldn't have worked. The women wouldn't have followed him into a dark alley, or he wouldn't even have been able to make them follow him, because he was really out of his mind. So this is a reason why I think it probably wasn't Kosminski, or the way we think of Kosminski. We don't really know if maybe there was more than one Kosminski, because if I have the time, I can explain a bit. The Kosminski theory, if I get this right, it came up because back then there was this theory what the Ripper was a Polish Jew. That was something that the police at the time thought.
Because a lot of Whitechapel was emigrated with a lot of Polish
Right, yeah.
Jews, and
A lot of Jewish people from Eastern Europe had fled to London, or to Great Britain, and ended up in London's East End, and there was anti-Semitism in the area. And one of the earliest theories was that it was a Polish Jew, and that was one of the theories that. So it ended up in the McNaghten memorandum. So Sir Melville McNaghten, one of the police officials, he kind of noted down three suspects that he thought, or he said, those are three that we think may have been the Ripper. I think it was a couple of years later, 1894.
yeah, it was Mike Ostrog, Aaron Kosminski, and then Francis
Druid.
Tumblety. Or
No,
Druid,
Druid.
yeah.
Right. So you can. It wasn't Druid. That's quite clear. From nowadays' point of view, it wasn't Druid. Probably wasn't Ostrog. That's also quite clear because he was in prison at that time in France. And the way Kosminski is described in this paper is very again something. It's another example of he didn't get the facts right, because what he writes about Kosminski is very vague, and not it's he doesn't give him a first name, so it's just the name Kosminski, and then Sir Robert Anderson, he was head of the CID at the time of the Ripper murders. He wrote his memoirs a couple of years later, and he says something about this. We know it was a Polish Jew, and there was this one witness even claimed to have seen him, but he didn't want to testify in court because he was a fellow Jew. But he doesn't give a name in his memoirs, and then it's so many it's so many names and different people and stories. So then there's Donald Swanson, who was he was kind of the one at Scotland Yard at the time of the Ripper murders. Every detail, every statement, every witness statement, everything ended up on his desk. So he was the one who had the complete overview of the case. So he had Robert Anderson's memoirs, got a copy of it, and he added some notes in the margin with a pencil. And he wrote down Kosminski was the suspect, when Anderson wrote the thing about the Polish Jew. And then, all right. So three people, they say it was Kosminski, but who was Kosminski? And then someone, Martin Fido, a ripperologist who died a couple of years ago, I think he found Aaron Kosminski, if I get this right, because he looked into the asylum archives and tried to find, who is this Kosminski guy? Who was he? Where was he? And then he found Aaron Kosminski. But the question is, because Aaron Kosminski was really insane and he lived until 1990 in an asylum. I think he was put into the asylum in 1891, if I'm correct. Died there in 1990. and the worst thing he does was, like throwing a chair or something at someone. So when it comes to violence, that was what he did. So there's not really a connection from this person Kosminski to the Whitechapel murders, apart from his name being mentioned in all these reports and in the memoirs. So the question remains, is he the Kosminski that the police were talking about? Or maybe there's someone else out there that we don't know. Maybe Kosminski wasn't even the right name. Maybe it was Kozlowski, whatever, a similar sounding Polish or Eastern European name. So I think this is, once again, it always comes back to the same thing. We don't know anything actually. Yeah, but that's the Kosminski
Could I
story.
ask what your opinion is on the police investigation? Do you believe that it was done properly? I mean, obviously, we can quarterback it since it's, however many years later, we can look back on it and really kind of pick it apart. But Sir Charles Warren stepping down, I've noticed that with some investigators, it seemed like they probably would have had a better chance because I think later two of them that I'm thinking of became private detectives and still kept up an interest in the case. But it seemed like they had conflicts with Sir Charles Warren at a point, or they just didn't like the leadership under Charles Warren. And I'm sure he was doing his job. I'm not going to criticize him a whole lot, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on the police investigation into this. And then do you think that the police were better off without Sir Charles Warren, even though it was, I think, only a short time until the Ripper murder ceased?
So I think the police, I think they were pretty heavily criticized back then by the press because of Sir Charles Warren, because he was heavily criticized by the press. But apart from that, I think they kind of did the best they could under these circumstances. I think some of the criticism is not really fair because, as you say, they didn't have the possibilities that we have today. They didn't take fingerprints. They didn't really. They did. The only victim that was photographed at the crime scene was Mary Kelly. So, for example, this was something that just started crime scene photography, because photography had just started basically at this time, 1888. So they didn't really have a clue what to do apart from bringing in as many policemen into the area as possible, in the hopes of either stopping the killer or finding him while he's killing someone, which hopefully no one would have wanted that, but that was basically the only thing they could have hoped for, finding him while he committed his crimes, which was something that didn't happen. But still, they didn't really have anything to work with apart from the witness statements. They didn't have any clues. They didn't understand the motive. We also don't understand the motive, but psychology, the history of psychology has changed since then. It's developed. We talk more about the psyche of people and why some people do these very sick and weird and pervert things. But back then they didn't really understand why someone would kill women that way. What was the motive? It wasn't a robbery. It was, why did someone do this? So they didn't really have any idea, any clue, and I think they did kind of the best they could under these circumstances. About Sir Charles Warren, so I'm not really sure. So he hadn't really come up the ranks, because he wasn't a policeman. He was a military man, and he was put into the position of police commissioner to kind of bring order back into the police force and also on the streets. And he was, I'm not really sure if he was that unpopular with his people, because he really backed up his people when they were criticized. His officers, he was always behind them, standing behind them. He was always backing them up. For example, there was a different story, but still, one policeman in 1887, I think it was, Police Constable Endicott, he arrested a woman on Regent Street and accused her of prostitution, Mary Cass, and she wasn't a prostitute. And the police constable, he ended up in court. But Sir Charles Warren, he kept backing him. He supported him and said, he didn't do anything wrong, although the policeman was in court at the end. So I'm not really sure if he was that unpopular with his people. He was very unpopular with the press. He was very unpopular because so there was this Bloody Sunday in 1887, November of 1887, where there was a huge gathering on Trafalgar Square of unemployed people, of kind of radical working class, all kinds of people. They did a mass gathering there, and the police, Sir Charles Warren ordered the police to go there, and there was huge, a clash between the police and the unemployed and the radical politicians there, and the police, they did a lot of they used a lot of violence, and he was heavily criticized for that, for doing that. And especially the radical press, they really, try to blame him for everything after that. Whenever they try to criticize him whenever they could. So when he stepped back, he stepped back because of a combination of things. I'm not really sure if another commissioner would have changed anything. I don't think he would have done anything different, because the people that were dealing with the case, they were the ones, who they were real policemen. So there wasn't really much of a difference. He was just the head of the whole police force. And also, there's this controversial story. Some people, criticize him for having the message wiped away in Goulston Street that we talked about.
It's on Gold Street, right? Gold Street.
Goulston Street. Street. He had this wiped away, but I think I can sort of, as many people can, many researchers can, we can sort of understand his decision, because it wasn't an anti-Jewish message on a building inhabited by Jews, in a street, in an area inhabited entirely by Jews. This was the night of the double event, so two women were killed. And then there was this message, and they couldn't photograph it because it was dark. They had to wait until daylight. But when day came, there was the Petticoat Lane Market on Goulston Street, which meant a lot of Gentile buyers went there to buy from Jewish tradesmen, and they didn't really want to, So Sir Charles Warren said, we have to wipe this off because we don't want anyone to see this, so we don't cause riots here, and people, Jews getting attacked. So I can kind of understand the responsibility he had at this point, but many people criticized him, for wiping away the message. And of course, the message ended up in the papers, and everybody knew about it in the end. But at this time, after the end of that night, I can understand why he did that.
I want to ask about, when it comes to the historical impact of the case, it being kind of this unsolved mystery. Who do you think did the most to keep that kind of mythos alive? Was it the whole press reporting, or was it just the police when it came to different leads? Obviously, a lot of people wrote autobiographies or wrote things about their time, or had a diary or journal or memoir of some sort, and they start having speculation on their part of who they think, or even leads that were going to be pursued, people that were spying on as suspects. Which, in your mind, has created the most historical impact when it comes across the globe amongst ripperologists and then the common people? I would say movies for common people, but I feel like a ripperologist, you're looking through a detective's notes, you're like, this guy had it. He was right there.
Well, I tend to agree, especially for the common people, with movies. Well, first of all, maybe books, because there were novels before there were movies and films. But definitely, it's always been a topic in movies, kind of ever since movies started. And for ripperologists, I think that's so. What I really found, or what I can. Let me think about how to put that. So if you go to London today, the Jack the Ripper story, or the Jack the Ripper himself, the figure, the whole thing, it's such a big part still of the London history and the London culture. So you can go there on whichever day you choose. You can go through the East End of London, and there's Ripper tours at every corner. So there's a huge interest in the case. Um, and I think, this is not something that, that's been recent. This has started, the year after the Ripper murders, basically. So people went there to go, to go to the crime scenes. People, local people led people from the West End to the crime scenes, for example. And it very quickly became kind of a cultural, historical heritage, if you like. The area, the whole East End, became identified with the whole story with the Ripper, and I think that played a huge role in keeping the thing alive. Because first of all, well, I'm not only talking about London now, but this is where it all started and where it's still very, very big. And apart from that, I think, the back then in the newspapers reported about the case in 1888 all over the world. So it was a popular, a global phenomenon, um, even back then. And I think that's also one of the reasons why it never stopped. No, whenever, as soon as similar murders happened anywhere, people were like, oh, Jack the Ripper, Jack the Ripper. And even later, it was always a reference. So I think that was something that you just kept this whole thing alive. And people started as early on, they started to speculate, who was it, why did he stop, where, what happened? So it's become this ultimate mystery, if you like. And yeah, it never ceased to, it never ceased. It just became bigger and bigger and bigger. It became an industry. If you look at the tour guides, I did some tours myself with people through the East End. And it's very, it's very fascinating to do that still. But I know it's hard to tell, and this is where things meet, because the common people from the movies, they think, I'm going to have to go to a tour and see where this happened. And then they kind of, you kind of open their eyes, because and once again, they see, oh, this is what really happened. This is just a fiction. These are the facts, but, you change the perspective. But yeah, it's an ongoing phenomenon. It really is.
I guess from a ripperologist standpoint, I mean, what have you noticed being a ripperologist amongst other ripperologists? I mean, obviously, people that have their own independent theories, I mean, they make sense. That's the thing, is that some of them, when they really kind of put it to you, like the Michael Tumblety one, definitely convinced me on a lot of things. But like again, it's too new for me to say who would be a suspect. I understand there's conflicting accounts with everybody's story, but obviously, with people doing research, they do come across a lot of things that are weird connections, whether it's a newspaper article or something that was written or this or that, that makes it kind of difficult, and it brings more of the case out there. Which, I mean, again, another question would be the commercialization of Jack the Ripper. That obviously is everywhere, T-shirts, stuff like that. And that happens with a lot of events too. It's the same thing with the JFK stuff, but this one, with all these years later on, we're getting like more evidence, it seems like, or more better material or resources, and it makes it even more complex, because it's not more detail in the sense that it's narrowing down a killer. It's more detail in the sense that you're turning out that the brother of a cousin who knew an uncle knew a guy who lived next to another dude who was Jack the Ripper. You're like, oh, fantastic.
Right. Right. Absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah. There's this example by Alan Moore, who wrote From Hell, the great writer Alan Moore. He wrote this comic From Hell, and I think in the appendix he says something along. I think he draws a comparison to the snowflake, the Koch's snowflake, which have the shape of the snowflake, and if you put it under a microscope, it consists of tinier, shaped snowflakes, and it go as tiny as you like, but it's still a snowflake. He draws some comparison. I'll have to look it up. Which he goes exactly what you said. One day we'll find out the nickname of Inspector Frederick Eberlein in school. In the second grade, but you'll never leave. The circle of the snowflake that was there in the beginning. You'll never go outside. You find these tiny little details over time, but it won't change. You won't go beyond probably what's what you want to find out. And I think that's quite a nice example. But sorry, I forgot your actual question. Which is,
I was saying about the commercialization, obviously, of Jack the Ripper.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's huge. I mean, if you go into the East End, or not only the East End, but if you go to London, there's this. You go to the East End, there's barbers. They call themselves Jack the Clipper. There's fish and chip fish and chip shops who call themselves Jack the Chipper. It's a chain. So there's always a bit of criticism against, when another one of these enterprises open up and people say, you can't really call it, it's terrible. Women were murdered. But that's what we had at the beginning. There's a difference between the Whitechapel murder, the actual happenings, which were terrible, and this kind of phenomenon, Jack the Ripper. So the public doesn't know that, but you can see there is a distinction between these two, because you can commercialize the one thing. You can commercialize Jack the Ripper. You can turn it into a movie. You can turn it into whatever you like. Put him into comics, and then there's the real Whitechapel murderer who did these horrible things, and we don't know who it was. But this Jack the Ripper thing has become so much bigger than the actual events. And of course, we should not forget the victims, which is something, luckily, it kept happening for quite some time now, that people also really deal with the women that were murdered, with their biographies and their lives, instead of just saying, this woman was killed, this woman was killed. It kept happening in the last 20, 30 whatever years, 40 probably, that people were really started dealing with these women and looking into their lives and their biographies. I think that's a very important thing too.
I want to ask about not any typical theories, but what's one thing for you that you would like to see get done with the future of the Jack the Ripper case? I mean, one change you'd probably suggest, or just anything that you would like to see. I know for like the JFK stuff, for instance, I'd like to see some files get released, but which if it's going to happen, I have no clue. But I wonder what the optimism is in the Ripperology community, if it was going to be something of an agreement or a name being publicly known or well accepted, rather than just many different speculations. Because it seems at this point now, it's been so much time that anybody's suspicion of a suspect or anything like that is kind of, you can't say no. I mean, you can do your best, but it's not like a 100% agreement's going to happen saying, oh no, it was this guy.
So I always hope, or we always hope, if I can speak for the community, we always hope that someone will find something in an attic somewhere that hasn't been known yet, or maybe find some photographs of the crime scenes or of the victims, or find some documents that were not, that weren't known to exist, or there's a name in there that we have never heard of. This is something that we always think about or keep thinking about, and it is something that does happen. If you look at, there's Donald Rumbelow, who was a policeman in the city in the 1960s, I think, and he became a crime author, brilliant ripperologist. And he went into, when he was a policeman, he got the task to write a book about the city police, I think, London City Police. And he went into the archives, and then he found out what happened to some of the stuff they had in the archives from the Ripper times, from 1888. And he tracked it down and found, for example, he found the photograph of Miller's Court, where Mary Kelly was murdered. So things can still be found and still be uncovered. And, some of these things, they were found in, some policeman's home, or, the relatives of a deceased policeman's home. So there's still this hope that something may be found. For example, maybe another image of Mary Kelly from the crime scene, because it's pretty clear that more must exist, or more images must exist than the ones that we know. Maybe they are still out there. So yeah, there's always this hope. And also because with globalization and the internet, and all the resources are easier available, doing research is much easier now with the internet and all that stuff, and talking to people all over the globe. Um, many researchers have found out many things that in the last couple of years, like for example, certain characters that lived in the East End, you just knew their names, 10, 20, 30 years ago. But now you've got their biographies because people really went into the research and went into the archives and went, in search online of, relatives and all this stuff. And, they keep adding information to the images and to the whole picture of the Ripper saga. So this is something that I hope, or we all hope, will continue, but we don't know if it's going to happen and what will come from it, or if we stay, in the snowflake, if it's just all these tiny details, but nothing outside of the box. I want something that I hope, because I'm a big lover of London and its topography and its history, is that some of the East End has obviously changed a lot since 1888, not only because of bombing in the Second World War, but because of redevelopment and all the stuff that has happened since then. But there's still some of the some nooks and crannies, some of the alleyways are still there. There's still some of the original buildings, and some of the places where you can kind of still feel the atmosphere, or get a glimpse into what it may have been like. And I hope this will be preserved. At least this is very egoistic, but at least as long as I'd like to have this remain the way that I can go back to it. But knowing London and knowing the development, and knowing that change is change is important, I know that it probably won't stay that way. But this is something that's very close to my heart. Being in the East End and knowing this street hasn't changed, this building is still there, this pub is still there, the 10 Bells, for example, but not only the 10 Bells. Where some of the victims they were drinking there, maybe the Ripper himself. It's just part of feeling the history, touching the history. You get very close to it, and this is something that I really like. And I think this is also important to get a bit of a feeling for the era and the area too, to be there and feel the atmosphere.
Well, Phil, I appreciate your historical insight. I usually give guests here a minute at the end to be able to promote their links where people can find their social medias or any websites or anything like that, where people can find any work that you have done on the case. Is there any links you'd like to provide to any audience members out there listening?
Yes, sure. Well, obviously, being a lover of London and dealing with London history, there's my website, London Beyond Time and Place, where you can find all. I did some interviews with ripperologists, but also with some other people about all sorts of London topics. There's some walks there that you can download. That's something what people who are interested in that can go there and have a look at that. It's London Beyond Time and Place. And also, if that's fine, I'll just show my German book, because maybe you have some German audiences. It's called Jack the Ripper, Die Whitechapel-Morde 1888, Eine Chronologie. So that's a German book that I wrote with my mother, Dorothee Schröder, about the Whitechapel murders, the Autumn of Terror, focusing on the facts as more or less, or what we think of as the facts. So that's basically important for this audience. Yeah, I'm also a literary agent, so if someone who plans to write a book or wants to have a book published with a publisher, they can get in touch with me. I'll send the link if you like. I can send you the link to my website of the literary agency too. It's called Opera Scriptorium. It's a Latin name. And apart from that, well, I think that was enough already.
Your band?
Yes, sure. Yeah, my band. I'm a drummer. I'm a drummer with the German rock band Pariah Lord. That's right. But that's got very little to do with the Ripper or with my historic research.
I'm still going to link it anyway. It's going to be cool for anybody out there.
Please do. Thank you. I'm not quite sure if I sent you the links, but I can do that. So yeah, that would be nice. Yeah, and maybe it's just a little teaser. Right now I'm in Germany, but I'm actually planning to start some tours again in London. I did this a couple of years ago, but then because of COVID and some other things, I had to kind of stop. But now I'm planning to do this again. So maybe I'll do some Ripper tours again in the future in 2025. Who knows? I'll let you know.
I appreciate you again, Phil, for giving me the time. I'm going to make sure I link all your links in the description below for the audience members to be able to click on and check out. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank, and stay tuned for our next episode.